I'm delighted to welcome you to Workshop 2, Leadership Toward Positive Outcomes for All Students. Just one quick housekeeping note. As you work through your planning tools provided by Academic Impressions, if you would be willing to share those with us, we will send a request to you via email after the conference. We'd like to include some examples of how organizations or colleges and universities are using the planning tool in real life. So if you would be willing to share those with us, if you and your team or your table team have some good information, just know that we will be asking you for that and would welcome them in our post-conference publication. So Workshop 2, which is focused on positive outcomes for all students, is an extended workshop. We will begin with a panel discussion among our colleagues, whom I will introduce shortly. We will then have our luncheon plenary session with Brandon Bastide, and then we will turn to our outcomes conversation and a facilitated practice and team session with Jaretta Nelson from Credo. So this is a longer session because we have a plenary in the middle. What we've planned today is for each panelist to do 5 to 7 minutes of presentation, and then we'll ask a series of questions, and I commit to you that we will have time for the audience members to ask questions of the panelists. We have 3 desired outcomes, which you see listed on the slide on the screen, but really we want you to be able to identify the current systemic gaps, to see how the liberal arts can play a unique role in addressing those student outcome gaps, and then, of course, to develop an actionable plan for your campus. And again, this latter one we will also continue working on with Jaretta this afternoon. I invite you to review the panelists' full bios in the conference program, beginning on page 11. But I just wanted to share a little bit about each of them. Certainly, if you've ever done anything with assessment or NESE, Jullian Kinzie needs no introduction. She currently serves as the Associate Director for the Center for Post-Secondary Research and the National Survey of Student Engagement at Indiana University. And Jullian is one of the faces of outcomes assessment through her work with NESE and NILOA. She's authored several pieces on student outcomes and is certainly an incredibly generous and thoughtful contributor to higher ed's knowledge about student outcomes, high-impact practices, and how we can truly serve all of our students. Jullian once wrote, "Many institutions have been explicit about what students need to succeed at their institution, so students aren't just left to figure it out on their own." Today, I'm grateful that Jullian is with us to help us find guideposts, a word she uses, about how best to support student success. So thank you, Jullian. Tia Brown McNair is perhaps best known as the Vice President in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Student Success at AAC&U in DC, and she's certainly a very compelling and frequent speaker on these topics and others. I will confess what I'm most excited about with Tia is her recent book, Becoming a Student-Ready College, A New Culture of Leadership for Student Success. We will have a pop-up bookstore tomorrow, so you can find it there. My copy is incredibly dog-eared as it was a cabinet read. And there's one passage that captures, I think, the richness of Tia's perspective regarding our role as we lead towards inclusive excellence. And we find in the book, becoming a student-ready college requires each and every person who is part of the ecosystem to make a personal decision to take responsibility and ownership for student success. It requires each person to make every action, every task, every lecture, every assignment, and every experience expressions of care and emotion. It means realizing that being an educator is not just a profession, a career, or a job. It means defining your role in an ecosystem as a responsibility for fostering continual improvements and for serving in a role of support and guidance for students. So I look forward to hearing your comments today, Tia. And Noah Silverman is the Senior Director of Learning and Partnerships at the Interfaith Youth Corps. Noah has worked with many of our campuses on issues of interfaith dialogue and the role of such dialogue in educating young people. In a recent AAC&U article, Noah and his co-authors refer to 2 themes of interfaith excellence, themes which I believe apply to inclusive excellence and achieving outcomes, positive outcomes for students as well. First, they write, each practice is most effective when pursued with a commitment to both breadth, so the largest percentages of campus community having at least minimal exposure, and depth, select groups of the community having the opportunity to explore those issues in detail. And second, none of the practices is standalone. They are best pursued in some combination. When we think about inclusion in the liberal arts, I think we could all agree that breadth and depth, as well as the interconnectedness or the connecting the dots, is critically important. So I'm delighted to welcome Noah. And with that, I will turn it over to Jullian Kinzie to kick off our conversation.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I very much appreciate it. And I'm going to be the first to kind of violate all of the really good conference behavior here that I've seen and kill you with PowerPoint right from the very start. So I'm hoping that you haven't quite had enough just yet. So I'm going to see how much you can tolerate here. But I'm really happy to be here. And as President Hinton already indicated, my world is about assessment, learning outcomes, and helping all students achieve what the desired outcomes are in undergraduate education today, and to help institutions design more effective educational programs for them. So I'm going to speak from that point of view today, and I hope you'll be with me as I kind of share some evidence and some information from the work that we've been doing over the past, we're into our 18th year with the National Survey of Student Engagement. NALOA has been around more than 10. We really feel like we have a good sense of where and what's occupying the outcomes and assessment agenda these days. So let me share a couple things with you. First, I want to put forward a point of view that I think we are in a different paradigm right now. I think we're in what I'm calling a learning quality and equity paradigm. And I think this really resonates with Lynn's comments last night about the importance of attending to issues of quality and equity simultaneously, and how we need to reorient our practice around that. So I think this is an important thing to say, that this is the frame for my comments. And I think this is because we've really reached a turning point in higher education. We're at a position where we have to ensure that all students have high-quality educational experiences that will prepare them for the 21st century. This is the outcome we're after. This is what we need to assure, and all institutions are responsible for this. And I was really pleased. I prepared this before I got the swag bag from this meeting to realize that you all received a free copy of this excellent publication. But if you haven't delved into this, I think it's really worth the read. I want to highlight a couple points from it that are framing my thinking right now. The three things that really struck me, and it's a good read, and there are a lot of points I could have extracted from this publication, but the three that really resonate with me are the conclusions that they drew around their three national priorities. And the three that I do, which dwell mostly in the first priority, have to do with assuring students have high-quality learning experiences. And then the need, and this is where we get to what does this shift mean for practice, is that we have to make a more systemic commitment to improve college teaching. They just lay it right out there, that the change that we need to see around quality and equity resides very much in the teaching and learning space. That's where we need to think about improving. And then I think they wrote this specifically for me, how important it is to use data to enable institution-specific insights through nuanced analyses and effective student interventions. This is the acknowledgement of the need for data, but then the need to bridge that with specific interventions and action. It's not enough just to have information. We have to be thoughtful about what we're going to do with that information, and that's exactly what assessment is supposed to help institutions do. So all of these 3 points, I think, are really important in order to kind of situate this work that we're about to discuss and partake in for Workshop 2. And what I want to do is highlight a couple things that we're seeing around outcomes. So the work at NESE and NALOA has really led me to this point that one of the things we need to do around this learning quality and equity paradigm is to be more explicit, much more explicit about the outcomes that we're after in terms of student learning. And these have to be aligned. The second is that we need to keep our focus on proven, engaging, inclusive, and high-impact practices. There's kind of a whole range of things in there, and I'll go through a couple of those. The third is the importance of data disaggregation in all of this work. And we can't keep looking at the mean, the central tendency, the average. That's not enough. We really do need to examine populations of students that we're concerned about and the quality of their experience. And the last is that we need good leadership for assessment to help us make use of all this information. So those are the 4 things I'm going to offer a few tidbits on to frame my comments. The first about explicit learning outcome statements. This has just become so apparent in all of the work that we've been doing with the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. No doubt, it's part of our name as learning outcomes, but the important part of this statement is not about the learning outcomes, it's about how explicit we need to be, and who we need to make sure understands these. Outcomes need to be much more understood and accessible to students, parents, families, employers. We've got a lot of audiences that we need to think about, and we need to be clear about what students are to experience and achieve. The idea that these outcomes just happen is not enough. And I want to highlight this one as an image. This actually comes from IUPUI. If you've not seen this, this is IUPUI's hallway. This really is a stairwell. I did not paint or add those words to the image of the stairwell. This is actually IUPUI's stairwell up where they actually have their learning outcomes painted all over the walls. Now, this is a very literal meaning around being explicit about outcomes, but this is where I think we need to be. We need to be explicit about the outcomes we're after. We also need to be intentional about how these outcomes are aligned. So students see the connection between the outcomes that are expressed, that are in the courses, in their curriculum, in their program, and in their co-curricular experiences. How are we lining all this up so that they see how things are connected and not fragmented? There are lots of benefits of these explicit outcomes and alignments. The first is that student learning is enhanced when experiences are intentional design. So there's clearly something about how we design experiences that make a difference for learning. The second is that by being intentional and aligning, we're promoting equity because we're helping all students see how the pieces fit together. We're not keeping it a secret how this fits together and what needs to be part of that high-impact educational experience. We're helping them see the way and to fit their experiences in. We're also helping students by reinforcing what needs to be mastered, and then, the important part of this, communicated to employers or wherever they head next. I shorthand this by using employers, but to wherever they're going next, be that graduate school or into the world of work. They need to be able to communicate this, and explicit, aligned outcomes helps them. This is also a real potential around some of the things we were just discussing, I think, and what we heard in that mentoring conversation was the need to identify all educators on campus as having a role in mentoring or facilitating the educational experience of students. So by aligning outcomes and being more thoughtful about how we intentionally align the outcomes, it can be a real site for student and academic affairs or students or staff and academic affairs collaboration. So I think there's a lot of benefits for thinking about explicit outcomes and alignments. The other outcome I want to touch on, and this has been raised several times already in this meeting, is about the notion of workplace skills. I like the term employability. It's the one that's captured my attention right now. Employability as a concept. The idea is that these are skills that are attributes. Attributes is a word I also like, that make a person able to gain and maintain employment. They're the essential skills. These are critical outcomes that was my time, that we need to be more intentional about. I did set my own timer here, so I'm gonna indulge another minute here. We need to be focused on these employability outcomes. I want to share a data point here around the solving real-world problems that Lynn touched on last night. How much experience do students get solving real-world problems? And we've been asking this question on NESE from its inception, and this is a little audience participation here. True or false, simple true or false. About 75% of seniors who have responded to NESE report that their experience at the institution substantially, this is a pretty high bar, very much or quite a bit, contributed to their knowledge, skill, and personal development in solving complex real-world problems. Anybody want to guess true or false on this one? 75%? Think that's about?
True.
Okay, well, there are two options, and I've heard them both. It is false, 64%. So it's less than 3/4. At senior level, this is seniors, they're about ready to graduate, leave the institution. I don't think that's high enough. That's, you know, I would set the threshold at a 75 or above that students would say this. So I think we have some work to do around this. I'm going to do a couple quick points here. I think the way into this work is by the power of high-impact practices. We've talked a little bit about this. I think you've all seen the evidence about the value of high-impact practices and what they can provide students. They're particularly important for students who are underrepresented. They convey even greater benefit for students who are underrepresented. I looked at results even for students who are in our baccalaureate liberal arts colleges, which actually have the highest proportions of students participating in high-impact practices. There seems to be a natural advantage of being a baccalaureate liberal arts institution that allow more students to participate. These numbers or proportions look pretty good, at 69% of students indicating some internship, but there are equity concerns around this. This is where I get to the disaggregation point. If we really look at who's having these experiences, there are some disparities among student athletes, among engineering majors of all of the majors I could pick on, women in undergraduate research, African American students and first generation students in internships. I'll just illustrate with one to let you see just the gaps between first gen and non-first gen students. Internships is the most severe, it's greater than 10%. There are gaps that we still see around these practices, even at the best institutions. So we need to think about those high impact practices. The last point I want to make from our data on outcomes, important outcomes, is around a commitment to diversity. Seniors, in this case, are reporting the extent to which they believe the institution is providing students resources needed for success in a multicultural world. We're faring pretty well on that. About 60% of seniors indicate they feel like there are resources for their success in a multicultural world, but only, we start to dip lower when we look at whether the institution has helped students develop skills to confront discrimination and harassment. I don't think 55% of seniors indicating that they've developed these skills is enough, given the world that we have that they're entering and what we need from students today. So I think these are all things that call us back to the question about equity and outcomes and how we can really assure that we are creating high-quality, equitable learning experiences for all students. So I'm going to stop there and let Tia go next.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. If it's okay with you, I'm going to stay right here. We should give Jullian a round of applause. So first, I want to thank Mary for inviting me to be here, and just to make sure that I recognize my co-authors of the book, Becoming a Student-Ready College, Susan Albertine, Michelle Asha Cooper, Nicole McDonald, and Thomas Major Jr. It was all a labor of love for us to write that book, and we're glad that it's being received well within the higher education community. I'm glad that you ended with data, and then I'm going to pick up a little bit. Is that okay?
Please.
All right, that's great. When we looked at the questions that we're going to talk about for this particular workshop in this session about understanding what are some of the systemic gaps in student outcomes and what's our role, how the liberal arts play, what's the role the liberal arts play in closing those gaps, and then really been focusing on what are the particular steps that you can actually do to help eliminate those gaps. I want to start by saying that a few years ago when AAC&U celebrated its centennial, we released a report here called Step Up and Lead for Equity. where we really focused in on the gaps in relationship to learning outcomes, high-impact practices, student engagement in many of those activities that we know are increase their learning gains. And when we were out doing this work and speaking across the country, I would always start by saying, you know what? Let's not keep focused on the data, because we all know that there are inequities in higher education. Is that true? Yes, we all know that, right? Well, it's not really true, because we don't know our own data. When I go out to institutions and I ask questions about that Jullian just showed you the data on, for example, about the inequities in high-impact practices, how many of you can tell us right now in this room, what are the percentages if you disaggregated your data on students who are participating in undergraduate research, service learning, diversity and global learning experiences, first-year experiences? That's a key question. If you don't know your data, then how can you be accountable for closing those equity gaps? So one of the things that we did when we launched a project called Committing to Equity and Inclusive Excellence, Campus-Based Strategies for Student Success, and this is the publication that we released on this. We had 13 campuses working on this. They call it Vision for Equity. We started off by having an equity academy. And at that Equity Academy, we asked them to actually bring their data. It was in partnership with the Center for Urban Education, because we have to understand our data if we're going to be able to chart a path forward on what it is that we're supposed to be doing. I've been struck by a couple of recent reports that came out in higher education, one being the Campaign for College Opportunities Left Out. How many of you seen that report? The Campaign for College Opportunities Left Out. When you focus on student outcomes, you can't just focus on the graduation, retention, participation, high-impact practices. You also have to look at the holistic development of the student, as Lee mentioned earlier. One of the things that that report called Left Out focuses on is that the lack of diversity of the people who are actually educating our students in California. And it said that 69% of the students enrolled in California are ethnically or racially diverse. But 60% of the college faculty and senior leadership on California campuses, and 74% of the academic senators are white. It calls out an issue for us. It calls out an issue that we have to address systemic issues in higher education. We can't just talk about what the situation is. We actually have to do something about it. So if you have an opportunity to look at that report, I strongly encourage you to do so. But I also encourage you to ask the question about the data for your campus. If you looked at the diversity of your students on your campus, how is that diversity reflected in the educators who have been charged to guide those particular students? That is a question. That is an actionable question that I'm posing to you today. Yesterday, the Education Trust hosted an equity conversation. And if you haven't had a chance to look at this report, I strongly encourage you to look at this one as well. It's the State of Higher Education Equity. And one of our good friends, Tiffany Jones and Andrew Nichols, they are part of the team that helped produce that report. And they talked about by state, every level by state. They looked at the attainment rates of adults, not just the students who we traditionally look at in higher education, but adults across the board. And the reality is that even though we think we're making progress with students of color, Blacks and Latinos in higher education, the gaps are actually getting wider. The gaps are actually getting wider. There are actually, in most areas, if you look at it across the board, the older generation of Latinos and African Americans, or Blacks that have pursued higher education and received a degree, the generation that's coming up now are actually attaining degrees at a lower rate. That means that there's going to be a systemic problem as we move forward, because we all know the benefit of having a post-secondary degree for lifelong success. Is that correct? Oh, you're gonna have to talk to me. Anybody who knows who's seen me, you're gonna have to talk back at me. It's like a call and response thing. So the question is, one, where's your state? Where's your institution? Where are you in actually really talking about the questions related to equity and inclusive excellence? One of the things that we also learned from this project for Committing to Equity and Inclusive Excellence is that you have to have a plan. I heard someone say the thing about don't just focus on the plan earlier. No, I believe in that. You can't just solely focus on the strategic plan, but you have to have the strategic plan and hold you accountable for the work. The strategic plan should be a living document. It should be something that actually says we know our equity gaps. When we released a report on underserved student engagement with high-impact practices, to our member institutions, and those of you who heard me speak have heard me talk about this before. These are our campuses. Linda, these are our campuses. AAC and UP, these are people who we say have you had the Kool-Aid, right? You've had it. You've soaked in AAC and U and what we talk about in relationship to liberal education and student learning outcomes and high-impact practices. But when we asked the question about equity, a third of those campuses didn't even have equity goals. And a third of those campuses weren't even planning on having equity goals. That's an issue. That is a strong issue. So one of the things that I want you as you're doing your teamwork to say, do we have equity goals related to what Jullian was talking about with student participation and high impact practices? Do we have equity goals when we disaggregate data on students' development of proficiencies, relationship to student learning outcomes? And if not, what is our institutional capacity to actually do that? What are the interventions that we need to put in place? We believe strongly at AAC&U that inclusive excellence is a core part of our work and what we do. But we also believe that it's important for people to understand specifically what that means. Inclusive excellence isn't just a vision, it's an action. It is a goal. It is something where you actually have accountability and institutional functioning in your relationships to the community and your engagement with students and student development theory across the board, and faculty development as well, and staff development. And in the book, we're very keen about saying that the very first principle in becoming a student-ready college is to stop this dichotomy between faculty and staff and actually say every single person on your campus is an educator. And as an educator, you have the capacity to educate students to the fullest potential, their fullest potential, and it is our responsibility. We're going to focus at AAC&U at our Diversity, Equity, and Student Success Conference on what we're calling, and you've heard this phrase before, engaged inclusivity. We're not just going to talk about inclusivity and say we need to make sure this is done or this is done. What does it mean for each and every person on a campus to be engaged in inclusivity? And that first starts, and we've heard this said before, Dr. Gail Christopher said this to us before, you can't have a conversation about inclusion without understanding exclusion. And one of the things that I hope that as you're working in teams, you start asking yourself, who on our campuses are actually excluded? Who are excluded? From the very conversations, from the actions, from the decisions of what we need to do to actually fully support making excellence inclusive for everyone. So those are some of the key things that we're taking away. We have a list of, and I didn't put it on a slide. We had agreed not to do slides.
I violated it.
And I told you, she knew I was going to call her out on this. I said, and Mary said, no, Jullian says she only has one slide. I was like, really? We know Jullian. I was like, okay. But one of the things that we learned is that you have to learn from this project and the work that we've been doing at AAC&U is the alignment of strategic priorities, having clarity in your goals and your language. Not everyone understands the difference between equality and equity and what equity-mindedness actually is, how you define inclusion. And before you start doing this work, make sure that there's clarity in the goals, because many of the campuses that we work with, when they go back and they start having these conversations, if there's not a shared understanding and a shared value for the purpose and the reason why you're doing this work, you're going to stall. So don't skip that important step as you develop your plans here and saying, do we have clarity in our goals and our language? Do we have shared values? Do we understand our purpose? Because in order for us to understand our purpose, we have to make sure that our students understand our purpose and all the educators on campus, or it will be useless and our work will start spilling its wheels. So I think Mary's looking at me, my time is up. We'll have more conversations and questions, but we did learn that it's important for you to think about the preparation. And don't assume that everyone knows how to do this immediately because you say it. That's what we learned. Don't assume that people may be committed to it, but they may not know how to do it in practice. So don't leave that out as part of your plans.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't have slides, but I do have a computer, so I'm somewhere,
Yeah, you're
somewhere
between.
in
Yeah, no,
between.
yeah.
So I want to also thank President Hinton for the invitation to be a part of this, and I also, in particular, want to thank Margaret Arnold for all the work that she's done leading up to this conference so far. It's all gone incredibly well, and as someone who's frequently on the other side of these types of events, I know how much labor goes into it, so a big thank you to Margaret and her team for all that she's done. So for any of you Monty Python fans out there, now for something completely different. I do not have any data to share with you. I am not a formal part of the Academy. I work for an organization called Interfaith Youth Corps, or IFYC. Some of you may be familiar with our president and founder, Ibu Patel. We've had the privilege and the honor of working with many of your campuses around interfaith engagement in its various forms. For those of you who are not familiar, the mission of Interfaith Youth Corps is to build religious pluralism in society, and we work through higher ed to do that. We see higher ed as a great vehicle for sort of institutionalizing that norm in broader society. The first sort of conceptual distinction that we make is that there's a difference between diversity and what we call pluralism. So this comes from Diane Eck, who's a scholar at Harvard, and she sort of makes the observation that diversity is really just a descriptive word. It tells you about the existence of people from different backgrounds cohabiting in space, but it doesn't really tell you very much about how they're interacting with each other. So, to wit, Syria and Iraq are both very diverse, religiously diverse societies. They're not the goal. That's not what we're working toward. We're trying to work towards something different. Thank you for the chuckle. We're trying to work toward what we call religious pluralism, which is the sort of engaged, positive, the positive engagement of difference towards a common good for everyone involved. And we think that has sort of three basic points to it. One is a respect for different religious and secular identities. The second is the active development of relationships across lines of religious and secular difference. And the third is the fostering of a commitment to the common good, to there being good for the community beyond just your own religious or secular group. And we think college and university campuses are a great place to do that. So the first thing that I want to say is that I am the proud product of a liberal arts education. I double majored in international relations and religious studies at Connecticut College, and it was really in that mix that I discovered my vocation in both the sort of more prosaic economic sense of paid labor and in the sense of like life-giving purpose, like my calling in life. I discovered my vocation in a liberal arts environment, and I am pleased to say that I use my liberal arts degrees, both the critical thinking skills as well as the actual content and substance. I'm maybe one of the few people who remembers what I learned in my classes in college every day in my job. So, Andrew Del Banco writes in college what it was, is, and should be that if anyone were to make a list of the sort of crowning achievements of American civilization, one of the things you'd have to put on the list, alongside things like baseball and jazz and any number of other things, you'd have to put the 4-year residential liberal arts college. It's one of the things that our civilization, our society has done amazingly well, and it's something that we should all, I think, be proud and privileged that we get to be a part of. And so I feel very blessed that I came from that and that I'm still a part of that. As best I can tell, I think there's sort of two main contributions that Interfaith Youth Corps and that I can make to the conversation that we're having this morning. And the first one is more straightforward, perhaps, and I imagine, or at least I hope, will be positively received by the group. The second one, I might be going out a little bit more on a limb, but we'll see. So the first is basically, does our conversations around inclusive excellence and diversity include religious diversity? Do we think about religion the way that we think about other aspects of intersectional identity? And what are the different complications that come into play when we do think about religion alongside those other aspects of identity? So does your institution, from top to bottom, support its students to live and express their religious or non-religious lives freely on their campus? Can Orthodox Jewish students get into their residence halls on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, without using electronic key cards that violates the Sabbath? Do Muslim students have a place to pray that isn't underneath stairwells, as has been the case at Colorado University for some time now? Do Hmong Buddhist or Nepali Hindu students have the ability and feel comfortable to contact their professors or their dining hall staff to tell them what their religious needs are about what exemptions they need from class, what food they need, what dietary restrictions? Is there sort of a basic understanding of the religious diversity of your students, and are you incorporating that? And for many of us who perhaps work at church-affiliated schools, how are you balancing that sort of, that welcoming, inclusive identity and philosophy with the historical heritage of your institution? And how are you building an interfaith, a sense of religious pluralism, interfaith cooperation on your campus, not in spite of your Lutheran or Catherine or Catholic or Presbyterian identity, but actually because of and out of that identity? And have you done the work to figure out what that means? The second sort of subpoint on that is, do you think about educating about religious diversity as part of your curriculum and part of what it means to be a responsible, engaged citizen in the world today? Is that part of how you think about the mission of your college? So I think we would all feel as though we had failed if we graduated students who had had no exposure or experience with people or ideas from different racial or economic or gender identities from their own after they spend 4 years at your institution. Can you say the same thing about religious identity? As we think about the liberal arts as not only, but also preparing people for practical employment, is there any profession that doesn't require, in the 21st century, some knowledge of different religious identities today? So for example, I don't know what college the referee who cited Hussein Abdullah for showboating in the end zone went to, but I would like to think that if he went to one of your institutions, he would have learned enough about Islam to recognize what Muslim prayer looks like, and when Hussein Abdullah bowed down in prayer in the end zone, recognize that there's a religious exemption for that in official NFL policy and not penalize the team and take him back the touchdown, right? So if NFL referees need to know something about religious diversity to do their jobs well, I imagine many of the professions that your graduates are going into need to know something about religious diversity as well. The second sort of riskier point that I want to make, though, is that I don't know that expanding the diversity and inclusive excellence paradigm to include religion, that's okay, perhaps gets us entirely all the way there. So ultimately what IFYC really cares about is how do we build and sustain a healthy, religiously diverse democracy. And if I'm allowed to reference a Jesuit priest at a Benedictine university, one of the people that we read and think a lot about is John Courtney Murray, who was a political philosopher and Jesuit priest and theologian, and he basically asks the question, in a diverse society like the United States, how much diversity can we really take? How much diversity can we handle before society starts to tear itself apart? How much unity do we need? What do we need to be able to hold in common in order to maintain sort of basic bonds of citizenship? And I think if you think about the phrase religiously diverse democracy and you sort of break it into its constituent parts, you sort of quickly come to the conclusion that it's not a very easy undertaking that we've all signed up for, right? So if religion, per Tillich and others, is about issues of ultimate concern, the things that we care most deeply and fundamentally about, and diversity is not just the differences that you like. One of the things that we're fond of telling our students is that diversity is not just samosas and egg rolls. It's also dealing with people who have really different, and in some cases, opinions that you think are morally wrong about the world, and figuring out how to engage with them. And a democracy is a place where we all get to make our private, religious, secular, philosophical prescriptions public policy. That's what we get to do. We get to vote, we get to organize, we get to try and make our own view of the world the norm in society. So we've all signed up for an enterprise in which we are publicly engaging with other people who believe radically and fundamentally different things about the issues that we care most deeply about every day. So it's not necessarily going to go super smoothly. There's, to state the obvious, there's a great scene in Angels in America where there's two characters, and one of them is gay, and he meets this other character who's Mormon, and when the Mormon character figures out that the first character is gay, the Mormon character says, "Oh, you're gay, I'm Mormon, we don't believe in gay people." And the gay person says, "Oh, that's okay, I'm gay, we don't believe in Mormons." So there's sort of a sense in which our identities, our own various religious and philosophical identities, almost by definition, or at least can, exclude other identities that we are trying to include into our society, into our campuses, right? Not all of our identities are actually mutually reconcilable when you get to some of these fundamental issues. So we're increasingly concerned at IFYC that there is sort of a growing tribal divide in our country, and this has already been mentioned several times, in which, broadly speaking, society is sort of cleaving into a left tribe that is appropriately and understandably, and I personally have great sympathy with, concerned about issues of marginalized identities, and there's, broadly speaking, a right tribe that I think understandably, and at least I'm sympathetic to, concerned with preserving a certain type of Christian identity in society. And increasingly, those two tribes are cleaving, and we see it in our national discourse, we see it on our college campuses, and in higher education as well. So one of the great privileges I have at IFYC is I get to travel to many campuses, and I was recently at Amherst, and I was doing a training with student affairs professionals, and as people were going around and introducing themselves, they said their name, they said their institution, and they said their gender pronouns, he, his, him, he, her, hers, they, their, theirs, etc. Totally understandable. I imagine it was done as a move towards inclusive excellence. It's a practice that I understand and have deep sympathy for. I also was at Campbell University the same month and was doing a training for student affairs professionals, and when people went around, they said their name and their role and what church they go to. That's how you identify yourself at Campbell University. So how is higher education figuring out ways to not just reflect and replicate the tribal divide that we see going on in society, but actually figuring out ways to bridge that and preparing our students for the fact that as we're trying to build inclusive excellence on our campuses, being an engaged citizen in the 21st century means you have to deal with people who don't believe you exist. That's part of what it means to be a democratic citizen. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah, very much. That was lovely. So our presenters gave us a great deal to think about, and I want to ask if we could get the microphones going around the room. I'm going to toss out one big question, but we have only a little time before lunch, and so I want the group, I promised the audience you'd get to ask questions. So the microphones will begin circulating. But here's my question. So recognizing that we are each in our own context, we're each in our own community here, we've heard lots of great insights and wisdom that we can take back home and apply to ourselves. But I want to ask each of you, since you called us to be explicit, Jullian, give us one task or data point or idea or thing that we could go back to our campuses to do that you think would be the most value added. So I want to just put you on the spot a little bit. If you were to say to us, irregardless of our context, what is the one thing you should look for, find out, or do, what would it be?
One thing? I had 25 slides, Mary.
I thought there was the one, so I didn't know.
Difficult for her. This is difficult.
The one thing.
Okay, so I'll go first then while she's thinking about that. I want you to know your data. I want you to know your data. I want you to ask questions about your data. I want you to say, well, if we have a learning outcome if we say that we want all of our students to be critical thinkers and we have our defined learning outcomes and you have that whole list, quantitative reasoning or whatever, then you should know on your campus what are the percentage of students, the actual number of students on your campus, if you disaggregate that are actually developing proficiencies as critical thinkers, as problem solvers, as quantitative reasoning, ethical reasoning, whatever your defined learning outcomes are. You should actually know your graduation rates, disaggregated, your retention rates, your progression rates, who's participating in high-impact practices, the relationship of your faculty to the actual student population. That is a core starting point. If you don't know your data, then you cannot set equity goals. You cannot think about the interventions. You cannot ask additional inquiry questions. You cannot interrogate the data. You cannot interrogate the policies and the procedures that are actually making that data actually real. So I'm asking you to know your data. Know it and be conversant on your data. Not just where you get a report and you look at it, but actually be conversant on your data so that when you're in these meetings and you're having these conversations, you can actually focus on data-informed decision-making.
Thanks, Tia. My comment actually just continues that one. That's normally mine is the data one, so thanks for covering the bases. But the piece that I would add to this is more about the populations that you're concerned about. So I think coming at this from two ways is what populations are you concerned about on your campus and how are you really using the data to illuminate the quality of their experience? And then the other way into this is, what are the goals you really care about and the things that you really, the promises you make fundamentally. What are the promises you make and what can you say about those points? So those are the two ways I would even get more specific to Tia's suggestion.
Thanks, Julian.
So I think broadly speaking, diversity work in higher education or in liberal arts is actually two different projects. One is protecting and supporting marginalized, systemically and historically marginalized and oppressed students, and I think the other is figuring out ways to facilitate conversations across lines of deep difference. I actually think those two enterprises are not super easily amalgamated, and so my question would be to think about what are you doing on your campus. I think both are important and part of the liberal arts, and I think my challenge is to go back on campus and ask yourself, what am I doing in both those areas? Is the work that I'm doing to protect and support marginalized students on campus to get them greater access, is that actually helping or is that hindering, and do we need other efforts to figure out how to facilitate conversations across lines of deep difference?
Excellent. So out in the audience, questions that folks have. I see a hand up here and one in the front here.
Hi, Ty Coleman with St. Kate's. Thank you all for your presentation and the useful information. I wanted to ask the question to you about religion and blame it on being a student of the liberal arts. I find your comments very provocative, very healing in the times that we're living in. To kind of put you on the spot, you say that we have to learn to live with people who have different perspectives, particularly perspectives that we may not exist to them. How do you teach in a context where you teach students who not only do not exist, but they are subject to genocide and people don't want them to exist? So for example, if I have students who are more likely to be subject to police violence, students who are more likely to be denied access to rights, right? Muslim students with the recent Supreme Court ruling. And again, it's not to put you on the spot, but we're here in this great conference, engaging in critical thinking, having a holistic community. What is the challenge for us in liberal arts when we have to answer those hard questions where we do have people who are going to be subject to violence and death, right? It goes a step further. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, but in many situations, putting children in cages, taking children away from parents, killing, this is the context of what we're in. How would you take that a step further if you can?
Yeah. I'm so tempted to say, well, I don't actually have to teach in a college university campus, so I don't have to, but I mean, there are a few different ways to go with this. I mean, one is to acknowledge that part of the challenge of the tribal divide right now is that the current administration is not just associated with a particular tribe, but is also trying to undo everything that lowercase liberal democratic society believes in, right? So part of the challenge of figuring out how to oppose that is to oppose that in a way that's actually for the preservation of diverse democracy and not in a way that actually just further participates in tribal divide. So which is to say, I think there's some moral issues that we all have to feel called to act on and to take issue on, and I think we're allowed to say, like, this is a stance that I'm taking, even if it is not one that is going to be agreed or understood by other communities.
And maybe it's just a notion of, I didn't ask the question well, does a liberal arts curriculum have the capacity to address that need and situation of those students that we say that we are serving? And to give a concrete example, I had a successful student, first generation student of color, whose friend was murdered by a police officer. Mm-hmm. And that student, understandably so, couldn't successfully matriculate through the institution for that semester, right? I get it. Maybe, and again, I can't speak for them, but trying to be compassionate and empathetic, maybe she didn't feel that we could meet her needs of where she was at and in that situation, and not to stereotype the students that we serve, but I think increasingly we are serving students who are dealing with these types of paradigms or choices or realities. Can the liberal arts address those needs? Thank you.
Can I just say something too? And because Minnesota is a place, I mean, the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort, Lynn, did you mention that last night? Oh, okay, I'll talk about it. So AAC&U is engaged in what a national effort called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And we are working with campuses across the country to really focus on what it means for us to dismantle belief in a hierarchy of human value. And what does that mean for how we design curricula? How do we engage with our communities? How do we, as educators, help our community, that's not only our campus community, but the community we live in, heal as a nation? So next week at Duke University, we are bringing together people that are in our local libraries, campuses, educators at campuses that are participating with us in this effort to engage in a preparation process to be racial healing circle practitioners. And the racial healing circle methodology, as part of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, really tries to focus on our recognition of our common humanity, which Lynn and I were just talking about a few minutes ago before this session. What does that mean for our work together? And as we talk about the different tribes, we have to at some point figure out what's the bridge, among our tribes. So that's part of the work that we're doing. If you get a chance, please look at us on our website and the work and the links and the resources. But our goal is to seed at least 150 Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation campus centers across the country as we go and we try to do this work at our campuses to build that capacity.
Yeah. Hi. Donna Hay Jones from the Washington Center for Internships and Academic Seminars. The panel was phenomenal, and I thank you all. My question, however, is for Tia in particular. I loved what you talked in terms of disaggregating data, and having worked in diversity work myself for several years, part of what I found, which has been very surprising to me, is that on some campuses, there is a fear of looking at the data because they feel they're actually targeting underrepresented students by identifying what the percentage of African American students who are succeeding at X is, what the Latino students' number percentage is. And it frankly at first was quite shocking to me because I think we often talk quite generally about systems of oppression and inequity, et cetera, but yet without tactical ways to know it and go about it, how would one address it? And a very quick practical example, one of my most recent positions on a college campus, I was in a graduate school in charge of career and professional development. It was the medical school. But I was in the health graduate program in terms of advising, and a couple of the undergraduate students who'd gone through that undergraduate program in pre-med kept coming to me and saying things that were very alarming to me about the fact that they'd been on the pre-med path, but were continuously, and they found their African-American peers being discouraged if they encountered a negative grade.
Yes.
That they were going to an advisor who, when their other peers who were from different backgrounds went and had failed or had encountered something negative, the advisor would provide resources, encouragement, et cetera, but they believed that consistently they were being discouraged and being told to choose a different major. Which was interesting because it led to an analysis of the data. The Alumni Association, the African American Alumni Association, actually lobbied the president and the Board of Trustees to do an inquiry into it. But it's weird, that was just word of mouth, that was anecdotal, that led to something more formal. What would you say to individuals who may feel, if on my campus I disaggregate the data, I'm actually in some way targeting or somehow making those students feel badly?
That you're not. That I think, and we've had that happen. So one of our campuses that came to the Equity Academy, they went back and they talked about the disaggregated. They immediately got a complaint, and that complaint was sent to their EO office, and they had to shut down their work for a few months because of that. I think we have to realize what our role and responsibilities are to our students. What is it that we're supposed to be doing? And in order to do that and to achieve becoming student ready, to really focus in on making excellence inclusive, we have to know who's succeeding and who's not. I go back to that conversation that we had with Gail and before and with many others. You cannot have a conversation about inclusion if you don't know who is excluded. And the data, those are those undeniable truths. The data tell us the things that people cannot ignore. So when you probably went back in with the medical school and you start looking at the data to see, oh, wait a minute, you actually have a significant number of students of color who are opting out or being led to opt out of this opportunity. That holds us accountable. We have to focus in on that particular piece. And people think that See, now I'm gonna get personal, so I'll tell you this afterwards, after the thing. But I do think that people use that as a reason to not address the systemic issues and not to face the realities of what's happening with student success. It's your institutional data. You can interrogate it and disaggregate it in a way as long as it's helping students succeed. And that is one of the things that we have to, you're not writing an article about it, you're not publishing it, you're not going, you're actually trying to improve your institution and to transform your institution. So that's what I would actually say. And just so you know that they lost, the people who filed the complaint that said we shouldn't disaggregate data at this one institution, they lost for that very reason. It's our institutional data. We should be asking those questions. But data hold us accountable. And people don't like that level of accountability.
There's a, and I'm sorry, Colleen, we are going to have to wrap up for our lunch and plenary, but there's a James Baldwin quote that comes to mind as you were speaking. Not everything we face can be changed, but nothing can be changed until we face it. And that's really what has to happen. And I think the liberal arts gives us the courage and the history and the power to face those most complex questions. And so as we look at this panel, and Noah said one of these things is not like another, but Noah's inclusion is really intentional here because it's imperative that we know the data. What are the gaps? What are they nationally? What are the averages? But then how do we boil that down to our own campuses if we're becoming student ready? What do we have to do on our own campuses to be student ready? What do we need to understand? And if, in case we get very self-satisfied, if we look at this by economic data or maybe data by race and ethnicity, what are some of the less visible ways that we exclude people? So I was particularly compelled by the example of the ID card on the Sabbath. There are many, many facets to inclusion. So we're often not comfortable talking about any of them, and then there are a set that we just find invisible and we ignore. But those aspects of inclusion that make that student uncomfortable and unable to fully participate in the life of the campus, that makes them unable to own their experience at a college or university, compromises their outcomes as much as more explicit encounters in life can compromise a student's outcomes. So I think it's really helpful to, again, we're sort of funneling in everything we do in the workshop from the broadest picture to what does this mean for a person's humanity on our campus. So with that said, I'm sorry, we are over time, actually, and Brandon Bastide is going to talk with us with quite a provocative title, Lynn. It's not that the liberal arts need a reboot, it needs a new name. And Lynn and I will have strong opinions about that. But we are so excited to welcome Brandon. So lunch will be served. There's a buffet line right outside. We will have lunch. We will welcome Brandon Bastide, and we'll continue this workshop after lunch. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.